All right, I've got Clyde Kusatsu on the podcast today. How are you, Clyde?
Well, thank you.
You've done quite a fair bit of movies. You were in Star Trek, were you?
Uh, Beg your pardon. I'm trying to get the AirPods to work, but it doesn't seem to be working right now. Hold on.
Yeah.
I'll just. Yeah, I'm still being heard fine by you then, right?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, cool. Then I'll just do it that way then. Yeah. So I'm sorry. Again, what was the question?
Yeah. So you played in Star Trek, did you,
Yeah, I
Clyde?
did 3 episodes in Star Trek Next Generation as Vice Admiral Nakamura, who
Wow.
went to the Space Academy with Picard, Captain Picard. We were
Eh,
classmates, but I outranked him.
Now,
So
and your acting career, have you had discrimination and have you had a lot of setbacks yourself?
of course you have to go. I mean, I say I was in high school. I started theater in the '60s. I went to Northwestern University Theater School. I was a theater major there for 4 years, from '66 to 1970. I graduated with a degree in theater, and then I came out to Los Angeles in '71. And back then, it was very difficult if you're a newbie to get cast. I mean, the whole thing is, well, you can't see you unless you have an agent.
Mm,
How do you get an agent? Well, did you do anything?
mm,
So it was like the catch-22, the chicken before the egg kind of a thing. But there was another way where if you were had say a union card from Actors Equity doing theater,
mm.
then you could join either AFTRA at the time, which is a television radio artist union, and or SAG-AFTRA. But at any rate, the 2 years was good stead. It was almost like doing postgraduate work and doing a lot of theater, keeping up the training regimen so that I was ready when I got my first opportunity in 1973 and was cast in an episode of Kung Fu
Mhm.
with David Carradine. It was a breakthrough series in the sense that it was the first time, even though David's character was part Asian, that the lead was an Asian character,
Mhm.
and just so happened to be in the Wild West, and also brought up the same time the anti-Chinese discrimination going on in the United States at the time, where the railroad workers from the West Coast to midpoint was the Chinese laborers who built that part of the railroad, and then from St. Louis to that point in Utah were basically the Irish that did it.
Mm.
So, but the most difficult part was from the West Coast through to Utah, Promontory Point, because of the mountain ranges and the harshness of the climate, the winters and snows and everything like that, in which a lot of times many Chinese laborers would die. And that's where the phrase wouldn't give them a Chinaman's chance,
Mm.
because they'd set up the explosion to blow out the rock, and they didn't care if people died or not.
Mm.
So it just moved on.
So have you worked on big Hollywood films as well with celebrities?
Yeah,
Wow.
I have. Yeah. So from first film I ever did, one of the first films I did was Midway in 1975. It's become that perennial when it deals with the Battle of Midway and the Japanese Navy and the Imperial Navy.
Mm.
And every year it's brought out. And it was the first opportunity I got to work with Toshiro Mifune,
Mhm.
who is one of the classic icons of Japanese film. And then a few years later, in '81, on a John Frankenheimer film called The Challenge, I got to work with Toshiro Mifune again in a similar kind of a role where, like in Midway, for example, I played the real life character of Admiral Yamamoto's aide. And in the first 7 pages that we open up the film, I would get these rewrites, pink pages, blue pages. And all of a sudden I was getting all the dialogue. Well, they launched land-based bombers, B-25, some aircraft carriers. And Mifune's lines were when,
Mm.
how, and I'm describing the whole thing. So then years later, when I'm doing the Frankenheimer picture, I got to shoot in Kyoto for about 4 months. I was the same kind of role. I was, explaining what the dialogue was and everything like that, or the plot. But then years later, at that time, Mifune-san wife was pregnant at the time. So years later, the daughter from that pregnancy, Mika Mifune, I wound up getting inquiry from NHK about having an interview done by her. And it was like old home week in a way. It's like so many years later. But she told me an interesting little bit of information that was very touching, in that she said, yes, my father would always talk about working with you and how much I helped you. I helped him with his English and everything like that. And I went, really? That's kind of cool to know that Mifune-san would consider and was very appreciative of the times that we did work together. Yes. So if you're talking about large films, Hollywood productions, I also, for example, did Paradise Road in Australia. For Bruce Beresford was a director, and we shot up in Port Douglas, up in Queensland, and also in Penang, Malaysia, and got to spend a lot of time up there, Port Douglas. In fact, that's where I learned that in Australia, since the continent was isolated, there are different forms of animal and plant material life, that you follow the directions, you don't veer from the path. If you're on the beach, don't lie down because there's saltwater crocs out there. And if you leave the path on the trail, you've got plants that can shoot spikes into your hand or your legs or whatever that would burn. And there's like certain trees of acid that will burn you as well. Then, of course, there's the 5 most venomous snakes in the world there. And then I just learned that I didn't go into the water of the Coral Sea off of Port Douglas, because they were saying that there is a kind of a creature that burrows in something about urethra. So it happens to both men and women. So that if you wind up peeing in the water, it opens up the gate so that for the creature to go in to your areas of the anatomy that have the urethra, and requires very painful surgery to get the creepy crawler out of there. So I was very grateful not to be to experience that one. So there was that, and so that was with, of course, Bruce Beresford, the director. It was Cate Blanchett's first film back then. We had Glenn Close and Juliana Margulies. There's a whole big cast of characters. Very hot up there in Queensland, the humidity and everything like that. And then another film I did that we shot in Hong Kong and London was Shanghai Surprise, that starred Sean Penn and Madonna when they first got married. But so we shot that in Hong Kong, and then interiors in London. But the best thing about it was that our exec producer was George Harrison of the Beatles. And it was his company, Handmade Films, that produced it. And at one point in Hong Kong, we're on location at the beach, and I see this figure walking towards me with a smile and going, "Hello, Clyde, you're very funny. The dailies are great." And I went to myself, Jesus Christ, that's George Harrison of the Beatles talking to me.
Wow.
And so I said, well, thank you, George. But, I got to tell you, growing up with your music, that was it. And then he just said, oh, yeah, well, that was another time, wasn't it? We've got to move on with our lives, don't we? And then he was carrying at that time, of course, like a Walkman. And I said, what you got there? He said, well, I'm writing a movie. Would you like to hear? And I said, sure. So he put the earphones in there. And I thought it would be like sort of like piano tinkling or, guitar or whatever. But it was full blown production because, of course, he's got his own recording studio in his home. And he'd have people like Eric Clapton or other people come in and lay a few tracks, and then you synthesize it all together, And then he just said, well, I'm writing the music and I hope Madonna will sing one of the songs. But of course, Madonna never did. but that was an experience. And so, I'm very fortunate in my career to be able to have traveled the world on location for different things. From like in Mexico down in Tuxtepec, where we did volunteers with Tom Hanks and John Candy. We were down there, and then a few years later, I was down in Mexico City doing. It was a 2-hour movie pilot of The Librarian, which was a thing that was on TNT. I don't know. I think it's been released around the world as one of the Librarian films, and of course, one big film I did in '04 that Sidney Pollack directed had Nicole Kidman and Sean Penn. It was called The Interpreter, which took place in New York City and dealt with the United Nations. And I played Chief Wu, who was the head of the United Nations security there. So what was cool about it was the first time a movie was allowed to shoot on the grounds and within the UN itself. I mean, even when Hitchcock attempted to film in there, he was denied. So then when he did North by Northwest, he could only steal a shot of Cary Grant and meeting Eva St. Marie of a taxi cab outside of it. That was the closest he got. So like the sets that were in my scenes were all there at the UN. So we shot that on a Saturday and Sunday. And it was around the time, one day it was all of a sudden, everything was on lockdown because it just so happened there was a security talk. It was the Iraqi war was going on at that time, so, and but then the workers at the United Nations didn't care for our president at the time. So whenever George W. would be speaking there, they'd take a cigarette break or lunch break and turn off the mics, speakers, so they didn't have to listen. Wow. And but it was working with Sidney Pollack was great as well. I've been very fortunate to work with a lot of well-known directors and very good directors, like Wolfgang Peterson, when we did In the Line of Fire with Clint Eastwood way back in '92, I believe. I think I was very fortunate in '92. I wound up doing 6 different films that just so happened in '93 were released, like Made in America, Rising Sun, In the Line of Fire, Dragon, wow. The story. For a while there was like the joke was I was having my own mini film festival going up there and everything.
So I looked up your IMBD profile. You've done a lot of work. Did you play in American Pie, or did you get close to the role?
No, I was the English teacher in American Pie.
In the first one?
Originally, I didn't know what people were talking about because at the time I did it, it was this casting director said, will you do me a favor? There's 2 young brothers are doing a film called East Grand Forks High, dealing with high school. And would you play the role of the English teacher? I said, yeah, sure, great. It was Chris and Paul Weitz who went on to do more. At any rate, I went on the set and all of a sudden these 2 young kids really came up and says, geez, thank you very much for being able to. I said, fine, you're welcome. And so you did it, and I did it, and all these younger people there had no clue what it was going to be. I didn't know if it's going to be a small independent trying to find a place. And then a few months later, there was all this talk in town about American Pie, American Pie. I had no clue what it was. And a friend of mine, Will Hoy, who's an editor, went, dude, you're in American Pie, man. It's going to hit big.
That was a good movie.
And it did hit big,
It was. I saw it. It was a good movie. Did you get into the second and third, or was just the first?
No, this is the first one. Just the first one. It's like sometimes you take advantage. You always have your ear to the ground, so to speak. Like I remember there was another little film called Harold and Kumar Go to White Castle. And it didn't do too well when it was first released. But it was one of these project films that on cable and DVDs, it just was huge, which led them to do Harold and Kumar Escape from Guantanamo. And so my agent said, well, they're looking for Harold's parents. And there's not much in the scene. I think the dad has maybe 1 line and the mother has maybe 2 lines or whatever. So I went into audition and I said, look, just combine all the lines together. And they said, and he said, you sure you want to do this? It's just kind of a tiny kind of a role. And I went, hey, this is the potential of being a franchise because of Harold and Kumar Go to White Castle. So that's what I mean by having your ear to the ground. And what may seem a lot of people not familiar, you kind of have an inkling it might hit, So wound up, we went to Shreveport, Louisiana to shoot it. And when we got to the set, the directors, the co-directors, the co-writers and producers were there. And they said, you know what? Why don't we just improv, just everybody have fun, just go for it. And we just did. It was terrific because everyone was trained to do that, and in essence, what you see in that film is what we improved, and they kept most of it all in.
Mhm.
So, and it really worked. And the reason why you do it is like kind of a cultural icon. We're going, hey, you were Harold Kumar, you were Harold's father on the thing. What happened in Harold and Kumar Christmas? I said, well, no, that axed out. That didn't go there. But it is what it is. And sometimes it's kind of fun just to be part of a franchise or a series of films or television, and upon retrospect, as I look, I'm in my 48th year now, my career, in front of the camera or behind the mic. And, so I'm very grateful to be able to still get to do this. I mean, recently I did, if you're in a Netflix aficionado, there's a thing called Never Have I Ever, which is like in its second season, a young adult thing, very popular.
Mhm.
And I play the lead's grandpa Ted.
Mhm.
And it was another one of those instances as well. I understand there's a lot of heat with this thing and it's very popular. And sure enough, it's sort of like now I've got almost a new cycle of younger fans are going, oh man, you're Grandpa Ted. I love that.
Mm.
And it was one of those things you go, well, okay, hopefully they'll pick it up for a third season. And I've been also during this pandemic, work has been very sparse because of the opportunities aren't there, because production was shut down completely for a long time last year and slowly got back to work. And it's still being worked out because we have to deal with the safety protocols around the world. Actors and performers have to deal with safety protocols because it's a serious thing what we're dealing with the pandemic. And so it's really important to mask up. I myself have been got my 2 vaccinations, Pfizer, and also testing. Like
Mhm.
you usually get a PCR test is what they call it, before you have a wardrobe fitting or before you have a table read. And then if for the instance, like there's a show called The United States of Al, which is a half-hour sitcom on CBS. And I just finished doing an episode of that, playing a doctor, in which before, you get that test before the table read, the day of the table read, you take another short nasal test. And then every day that you report to the studio, you take a test to make sure. And then you also self-test in the sense of symptoms so that before you drive onto the lot, you're cleared by the main studio system. Before you report onto the stage, you have to wait for the short test to test. It's okay to go ahead and do the work. And so that makes you feel very secure about the whole situation. And I see we have Kelly here.
Yeah. Hi.
Our moderator here,
Mhm.
handling the Zoom call. Hi, Kelly. Kylie.
Sorry, just listening in. I'm enjoying.
That's all right. That's all right.
I have to say, Clyde, and off the record, just my own opinion, I do love Never Have I Ever.
Oh, well, cool. I'm glad.
You're
You're
great.
one of the bingers on that then. Okay, that's cool. Great. See, with that one was really good because it's for the first time a whole younger generation was informed about the Japanese incarceration to the concentration camps during World War II. And usually that's sort of become dry history. And she goes, oh, yeah, right. That's what's happened. But then with the main character finding and learning out his grandfather was put into the camp and everything, it resonated much more, and it became much more pertinent for a lot of the younger people to be more aware of what's happening, because around this time, what's happening is that there's a whole, because of the pandemic and the blaming of the pandemic, this COVID-19 on the Chinese, called the Chinese virus or Kung flu, or all this part of what we talked about at the beginning, about this anti-Asian discrimination happening, stop the Asian hate kind of a thing, is very powerful, because it is an element that as each decade happens, it has a resurgence. But on the plus side of it all, as awful as it may be, what it has done was unite everyone in the AAPI, that's Asian American Pacific Islanders, to identify that it was like, before in the past, it would be, oh no, that is a Chinese problem, or Chinese American problem, or Japanese American problem, or Korean, or Hmong, or Vietnamese. But now everyone realizes that in the grand scheme of things, the race is considered everybody the target. And so now there's sort of like a unifying factor about that. And the ability now and the need for people to speak up against it, to push back, because so many times it's a cultural thing. You don't want to say anything, you don't want to make any waves, you don't want, but a lot of times in Asian culture, to draw attention would bring shame upon your family or your cultural group. I mean, in Japan, there's a saying, if the nail stands up, it's your duty to hammer it back down, so no one stands out, you know.
Now, you have a college degree. I was watching an interview, and your professor said you'd never be an actor. Is that correct? You decided you wanted to be an actor.
That's a true story.
College?
Yeah, because back in 1966, I suppose it had never encountered that all of a sudden there was a drama major that was of diverse nature, so to speak, you know, a non-white in a department, and I didn't know how to deal with it. So I did have, in my freshman year, a professor stopped me and said, why do you want to be an actor? Because there's only King and I and Tea House of the August Moon. How could you possibly think, and how could you possibly make a living? And it was, I mean, I was shocked, speechless, and I was devastated. It took a long time. So what are you going to do about it? You didn't have a comeback to that. And then I spent some time back home in Hawaii working on a night shift at this brewery, and making this self-discovery that if I have to work 10 times harder than a white student to get noticed, this is what we're going to have to do. And so when I got back that sophomore year, I tried out for directing scenes, other acting scenes, children's theater, whatever it took. And within that next 3 years in the department, I became a working actor within the department. Half the professors would cast me. Half the cast, those professors who wouldn't cast me, would hold me up as an example of the opportunities that students have to be working in theater, you know. And in the meantime, in the summers, I did summer theater in Aspen, Colorado, Michigan City, Indiana, Grand Lake, Colorado, doing what we call summer theaters, doing like, say, 6 shows. And all the roles that I played in summer stock and at university level were character roles. None of them ever were Asian. But that was great training ground for myself, because you learn to be a disciplined actor, and you understand that that's where I am. I mean, I once had my senior year, a younger Black actor say, it doesn't bother you. I said, what? He says, because you're oppressed. I said, what do you mean I'm oppressed? And I would ask my friends, Bill said I'm oppressed. Do you think I'm oppressed? And my other friends would go, what are you, crazy? You're one of the workingest guys in the department. How can you be oppressed? And I could see what in a way, because his point was, well, they'll never cast you as a lead, in the romantic lead to kiss the heroine, because of, you know, it doesn't work out that way. Of course, it's all chock-a-block now, it's all changed. But back then, it wasn't until I got to Hollywood in 1971 where all of a sudden I became an Oriental. That was the old term for Asian. That before it became Asian American. But at the same time, I'll tell you a little anecdote. The acting opportunities for Asian actors in Hollywood were very few. I mean, you could look at it in two hands, and they're always like kind of stereotypic, the Chinatown thing, or this thing, or the laundryman, or this and that. And it took a show like Kung Fu to become popular in the national zeitgeist, with Carradine, with this quiet monk who happened to kick ass as a martial artist and could overturn the bullies after him. So I wound up getting cast my second episode of Kung Fu, because I had done very well in the first episode I did. And they didn't have that many classically trained Asian actors in town. In fact, myself and another guy were probably the only ones. I mean, I once had a casting director in Kung Fu see me come into the office and says, "There you are," grab me by the hand and take me down the hallway and open the door and says, "This is the guy I'm talking about. He can talk." A lot of times they would cast to what the people look like, and then because they couldn't act, they just put the voiceover later on in looping, in dubbing, in post. So at any rate, I wound up, my second TV show was as a guest star, and I was played a middle-aged, so they grade me. That wouldn't have happened today. But after the first rehearsal, before we were to shoot, the director said, "Oh, Clyde, you're sounding too American. Can you give us an accent?" And your hackles run up and you're ready to have that chip on your shoulder activated. And I went, "No, hold on." So what I decided to do was I used a dialect like I was doing a stage production, like I'd done in Restoration Comedy. So I went, "Kwai Chang Kane, we the member of the Tongs," and cut. That's it. That sounds good. But that's the lesson I learned. It was different. It wasn't American, but I never sacrificed by doing like the real L and the R kind of stereotypic accent that they were looking for. Because if you can give them something different, you don't have to be defended about it, because all they're looking for is something that sounds different and doesn't sound American or whatever. And of course, the big thing of like a film like Crazy Rich Asians about 3 years ago was all of a sudden the world saw all these Asian actors speaking like Brits, Aussies, New Zealanders, and Americans. Mm-hmm. So it was like, I thought it was very cool, because where does it say that you have to sound a certain way with your English? And what's very cool about in England now, and then also you see a lot more diversity like in Australian productions and English productions, that so you may have a love interest between a South Asian and a white fella, or a black fella with a white Anglo-Saxon type thing. And there's nothing, I mean, aside if you're dealing with redneck kind of a provincial attitudes, for the most part, it's just accepted part of the social milieu, and which is kind of cool, And then further down under in New Zealand, they've got, there was a series, I think there was maybe one season where the lead was a Samoan detective in New Zealand. And I didn't know there's this big Samoan population in New Zealand. But of course, Samoa is just is one of the closest things to New Zealand. But again, that just, the more you see of diversity, the more it educates the world that the world is not a monolithic or the palette, the rainbow is not monochromatic, but a rainbow of colors, that's diverse. That's what a rainbow is. So that's why I always like to use that analogy, saying, the rainbow is not monochromatic. It's the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, which gets the point across without having to go into the whole racial, trying to educate people about it. A lot of times it's the simplest way is to make the point about racism, prejudice, and everything like that. Also, I remember years in my career, I would meet people from the Asian community, and they'd go, "Oh, thank you for your work. We always knew if we saw you, we wouldn't feel embarrassed." And I thought, well, thank you very much. Because back when I was growing up, it didn't matter how you sounded or whatever, but if you saw an Asian face, you'd go, come, look, take a look. It may be a houseboy and bachelor father or whatever, because you seldom saw people that looked like you on the TV, so, but now it, thank God, it's evolved. And so that the world knows now that it is a international marketplace, so to speak, and that there are markets around the world. That's what Netflix has learned, for example, that when people don't want to read subtitles, they want to hear the translated or dubbed version in English or whatever, but it has to sound like that specific country's character. And that's where actors come in. Instead of just a monologue of boring kind of without emotion, now you have, in LA at least, they're hiring actors to be Middle Eastern, to be French, to be Asian, whatever, and they bring an added, because they're acting maybe to what the character they're looping or dubbing, but it infuses that extra thing that the audience gets immediately and wants to see, and they don't need to have the subtitles, because a lot of people I feel conflicted about watching the thing and then reading it, whereas I'm perfectly fine with it. I've trained my eyes so that I'll be able to watch it and at least understand what's going on, and it doesn't bother me about doing that, so that's where that is.
Clyde, great podcast with you today. Where can people find you on social media or reach out to you? And what's your next movie you're working on?
Well, right now, heck, they're not writing much for guys who are going to turn 73. I mean, there's a couple of, there's a animated show called Phaeton, which is on AMC Plus. That's probably going to be released next year, where it all deals with cyberspace or whatever. And I play one of the characters in there. And then there's another animated show called Blue-Eyed Samurai on Netflix that I've done about maybe 4 or 5 episodes on it, which stars Darren Barnett, who plays my grandson Paxton on Never Have I Ever. And so, just keep busy doing that. The days of big projects are sort of not as readily available, but that's fine. I mean, I've been doing a lot of work as a unpaid leader in Sag-Aftra, the union, which is very rewarding in itself, to represent your fellow actors and performers, and making sure that the contracts are strong and then the rules are enforced, and that we are not our worst enemies when it comes to that, and that you can report violations or whatever, and do not report anything of that nature. That's what the union is there for, to protect you.
Sweet. I'll put a link in the description for Sag-Aftra as well. I'll reference your IMBD profile. But yeah, thanks for coming on today, Clyde.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome.